Today's session, as mentioned, is pretty basic. So this is really aimed at the users who are new to the gateway for your state and just want to get into how to enter data, how to use your data more effectively. So this is what you would see when you come to the VectorSurv Gateway. This is a generic login based on, it can be for any of your states. This is always a starting point. So based on your login, you will be redirected to your state's version of the website. On the right, you can see there are some options for login help. So if you forget your username, you can just click that. And you can provide an email address, and then that will help you know your username. If you forget your password, you can click that as well. So then you can enter either your username or your email address. That will send you a password reset link. We don't know your password. No one knows your password except you, ideally. So in the database, it's not stored as anything we can read. So we can't tell you your password if you forget, but you can, anytime you like, go to this forgot password link and it will send you the reset. You can reset that to something familiar to you. Especially for users like agency managers that may not use the gateway every day. I think this is very helpful. And if you don't have an account, you would have to request an account, and that can be done by the user, but normally that's done by communicating with someone within your agency who's managing the other users in the agency. All right, so going back to the login, I'm going to log in as a test version of myself, which allows me to log in as if I'm in a local agency in California. You can see when I did that, that flips to CalSurv, which is our California version of the gateway. If you did this in North Carolina, Tennessee, or Arizona, you would see your state's logo at the top and generally can access your state's capabilities within that. The capabilities are the same across states. It's just certain things shared among peer agencies are only available to users in that state. So you would see perhaps other agencies within North Carolina, Tennessee, or Arizona, but not the entire country's agencies. And then once you're in, the first thing to do is probably visit your settings. So if you are an agency manager, which is this user I logged in as is playing the role of agency manager, you will see options for both My Account, which is your own preferences, and My Agency. If you are not the agency manager, you will only see My Account. So you can control your own preferences, but not manage other users. There's a lot of different things you can do under My Account. I'll just click on personal information and show you how that works. So this is my user here. You can set your email address, of course, which is how we would communicate with you about any basic information about VectorSurv Gateway developments, as well as communications you would receive from either your agency or your state about test results and things like that. Here, I'm not defined as a primary contact for the agency. If you are an important contact for your agency, you want to set that to yes. And you can see when I did that, it turns all of the others to yes by default. You can turn on and turn off these different notifications as appropriate for you. I know some of your states are not dealing with carcasses, which is dead birds in our state. Sentinel chickens are also something our state does, so that may or may not be relevant to you. I think for all of you, you will care about arthropod delivery notifications if you're shipping to central labs, as well as arthropod result notifications when there are new test results in the gateway that you can go look at. Tube delivery is also a product of our insecticide resistance testing, so may or may not be relevant to you. But what I normally do for my own users, as long as you don't mind getting pretty frequent updates on your surveillance results, is just set those to yes. Some of your technicians and other users in your agency may or may not want any of those emails, and in that case, they can turn that to no, and they won't get those. All right, so, and then also under My Account, there's other basic options. Security details are basically resetting your password. Account preferences just have to do with how you would like to see dates, times, and so on. So if you want to see military time or 12-hour time, you can do that. The date is particularly important. I think for imports and things like that, you do whatever you specify here for date is what the system is going to expect for the format you're feeding into the system when you try to do imports. So do make that something that you would like to use for exchange of data with the system. And that can be any choice you like to make, but there's a lot of different options there. You've got different formats for latitude, longitude. I think most of us leave that one alone. You've got how you would like to receive documents as Excel, Word docs, and so on. Some other basic choices there. Length and mass and temperature and volume are just units that you specify in the system. That way it will give it to you in metric or English units as you prefer. All right, so for agency managers, and again, this won't be visible to all of you, you also have the ability to manage your agency's users. So we always start each agency with the need for the basic agency info, and we need at least one person to be an agency manager within the local agency. So for those people, they can go to manage users. And what I see is a list of all of my active users in my agency. Whether or not my agency is their primary agency. So occasionally, especially if you share a border with another agency or are collaborating with an agency, you might need to give view-only access to users that are not part of your agency officially. So you can do that as well, and you can see some of the ends there indicate that that's not the primary agency for those users. And that person also can add new users. So they go in and create a username, a password, a login type, put in basic info like name, phone number, email address, and then click add new user, and that person will then appear in the list below. So that's pretty easy. They're mainly these types of users. So view only, of course, they can't edit any data, but they can just see data. So that's sometimes for your collaborators in other agencies who just want to be able to look with your permission. And then user is the basic user type where they don't control other users, but they can add and edit any kind of data in the gateway. And then there's the manager who can, at higher levels, manage the other users. At the bottom, you'll also notice there are inactive users. So when people leave your agency, we don't delete them from the system, of course, because they might be associated with records. So you can go through and inactivate users anytime. So if you're collaborating for a period of time with someone, after they leave the agency, you want to inactivate, or after the collaboration ends, you want to inactivate, you can do that. That moves them to this lower list, which just means their login won't work for that period. And then if you need to bring them back, you can activate them again. So you wouldn't need to create a new user for that person. You could just reactivate their existing login. So you could go to the bottom and do that. All right, so that's most of what you would need to do at the agency level. There's basic agency information that, as I mentioned, we typically would work with you to populate initially when we create that first agency manager individual. And after that, you can manage it all yourself. Just so you know, there's the ability to create tokens. I won't go through that for the purpose of a basic webinar, but that's for software to communicate with our system. So if you have third-party in-house software that needs to connect to our web services, it can do so through a token, which essentially reproduces that user connection with a token instead of a password, so that the software can have permission to connect to our system. All right, so with that, I'll move on to entering data. You'll notice at the top of the gateway, there's all these different modules, so they typically have tabs associated with them. And so at the top, kind of from left to right, is the more general category of surveillance sites that you might want to define initially. Arthropod collections and pools, which have to do with the abundance counts from traps, as well as testing of pools for arbovirus surveillance. Sentinels have to do with our chicken program, so there's flocks and bands and testing of those chickens. Carcasses or dead birds. Application has to do with pesticide use, so where and when do you apply pesticides? So if your agencies are interested in recording that, you can put that in the gateway, which gives us a lot of potential for marrying the control effort with the surveillance information to ask questions about how effective the control is in time and space. Insecticide resistance, it has a variety of forms, which is both the molecular testing for KDR alleles, for example, in certain species. We have larval bioassays, and then we have adult bottle bioassays, where you put adult mosquitoes in a bottle, expose them to pesticide, and monitor that over time. That's our #1 area of the resistance module that gets used by local agencies. So that's born of the CDC bottle bioassay, and I'll talk a little more about that in a bit. And then under tools is where you make your data more useful. So ideally that lets you ask questions of your data in real time during the season as your data come in. So I'll talk more about those later as well. And then you see an issues tab, which is something Kurt's been working a lot on quality control. So if you have issues in your agency, all that really means is that there's something our system perceives might not be correct about one of your data entries. And so you can go in and correct those anytime. All right, with that, I'll start with surveillance sites. So when you click on these tabs at the top, you see that a list of the options shows up. Almost all of these have some form of new and manage. So for a new site, that's create a new site. For managed sites, that's managing your existing sites. And then there's the ability to form site groups, which are collections of sites that you would run calculations on routinely. All right, so I'll start with new site just to show you how that works. So this is what I would see if I wanted to create a new site. This is asking me initially for a site code. It's giving me the expected format. So let's say I want to create a new site. I first need to know what codes already exist in the system. You can see that on the right. These are the codes that are available for this particular agency. And then over here, you can also see the used, which is just the reciprocal of that. So let's start with this and say I want to create site code 278, which is my first available one. I can either type all those leading zeros or I can just type 278 and it fills those out for me. I'll say something like Joe's house. And then you can either enter coordinates in any of our three formats. So decimal degrees, minutes, seconds, decimal minutes if you want. Instead, I'm going to go to the map. So you can just go straight to a map, and that shows you for your particular agency where all those sites exist that are already registered. So certainly you wouldn't normally want to duplicate codes that are already in use and already known to your agency. So now I'm just zooming in on a particular place. Let's say I'm running a trap in a particular spot. You might want to toggle it over to the satellite view for many of your trapping efforts so that you can get a better view of what the landscape looks like there, especially in rural areas. Let's say I'm going to run a trap at the corner of this park. So I'm just going to click there. You can get the address if you want. That's using Google Maps under the hood to just place that dot on the map. It gets coordinates for you. At that point, you don't need to worry anymore about the coordinates because they're recorded. You can go over to decimal degrees and you can see it populated that for us. And then it's showing you again in the context of your existing site. So I'm going to create that new site. I'll go down, and normally your coordinate precision will be exact, meaning it's exactly at where that trap is expected to be, or flock, or any other surveillance element. You can get the elevation if you want. That's up to you. If you know the elevation, that's fine. These aren't particularly important because you could always extract that information later. The most important piece is where the site is, and then ideally you might say secondarily an address, because that gives you another data point to compare to the coordinates if you ever suspect them of being wrong in the future. So I'm going to say Arroyo Avenue and Alhambra Drive. That will give me hints about where that is. I'm putting in Davis County, YOLO. All right, and then I could click Save Site. You can classify that site based on census population data. So we'll be working to populate your state's census population data as well, so that you could do that as also. That's just based on population density to give you an objective way to classify them. And then I would click Save Site, which I won't do because I don't want to commit anything to this agency's data. But once you click Save Site, you'll get a little green message at the top to just know that that site saved successfully. And then I'm going to leave without saving that. And then I'll go to the Manage Sites page, and that shows you all of your existing sites. So most of the Gateway's pages for viewing existing data look like this. They have headers across the top. You can see that you can sort based on those headers. So if you click it once, it sorts one way. If you click it again, it sorts the other way. You can also go down to the bottom, and by default, it's showing 25 per page. If I want to see them all, I can just say all. I don't think I'll do that for this particular agency because you can see they have 81 pages worth of sites. So some agencies have a lot. Other agencies have fewer, but still this grows over time, as you can imagine. So I think for your agencies too, this can be as detailed as you want to make it. You can be very specific about site locations for any of your surveillance operations. I'll just say 100, but that shows me instead of 25, of course, like 100 per page, so I can go through and find existing sites. And that defines where you will be doing surveillance. So these are for your routine trapping locations. Any other form of surveillance like sentinel chickens can be done at these same sites. So you'd want to register as many of those as makes sense initially for your agency. We do have a special code that's this 00 code that exists for all of your agencies. So that has all zeros for the 6-digit code. In North Carolina, Tennessee, Arizona, you would also have that special code, and that's for those one-off trapping events. So when you use that code for a collection, we then let you place a dot on the map for where the collection was that doesn't rely on your registered surveillance site. So that's a special one. All the others have their own code and naming conventions locally. Another thing to know is the names of sites, they matter to you locally. So the code is universal in our system for that point in time, but for the name part, you can also include any local coding you want to use for your sites so that when you go to enter data later, that's searchable. So if it makes more sense to you than using our coding system, you can have your own conventions within the name field that then when you're typing in the collections, it will search that for you. All right, and then I just briefly, I'll show you site groups. So site groups is kind of a higher level way to group sites for calculators. So if you have sites associated with a particular habitat type, like marshes in your district or agricultural, irrigated agriculture, for example, you might have collections of sites that you define related to that. So if I wanted to find a new site group, I'll call this rice traps. I could do that. And then all you really do is go down below and you name whichever sites. They don't have to be near each other or any other thing. You can pick whichever ones make sense to you. You add those to that site group, and then you can save that site group so that later in calculators, you could use that as a collection of sites for routine calculations that you might use to know where you stand in terms of abundance. Rice in our area is an example of a particular habitat that tends to fluctuate together, where rice planting happens at a certain time. The water is on the rice fields at certain times that produces mosquitoes that may or may not exceed normal. So they may run traps in those areas strategically, repeating the locations over a number of years. All right, so with that, once your sites are defined, you're ready to start entering data. So under arthropod, that's probably of the broadest interest to most of you. The first thing you'll want to do is go in and configure a few things. So you can see config there is the first option. There are available species. We have worked with many of you, even in your states, to add species to our list. So we think we're getting close to having the species list pretty well covered for what we need in the continental US. You can see here for any given agency, they can go in and turn on and turn off whichever species makes sense to them, which just limits the lists later so that you're not dealing with all the universe of possible mosquitoes. So you can go in and check those however you like to turn on, like here's an Australian species that I clearly don't need checked. So you can turn those off. Those then won't show up in your list later for data entry. So initially, you probably want to go in there and configure whatever species are important to you. All right, now for trap types, same thing. This will be familiar to most of you. Mike Doyle has been working with us even in the last few days to populate this list a bit more. So we try to cover all of the big picture trap types that are relevant to you. I'll use my sort feature to sort by acronym here. So you can see, for example, there's generic carbon dioxide baited trap. If that's all you want to specify, that's fine. If you want to be a little more specific, you can put in ABC trap, CDC, EVS. These are the main CO2 baited trap types, so you could turn those on as well so the users in your agency could use those. The other option would be turn off the generic one and maybe turn on the one that you use specifically in your agency so that you can choose that anytime. There's a wide range of trap types and collection methods available here. So that's up to you how many you want to use in your agency, and you can make your list match that. I'll go to one more, which is the lab preference. So for those submitting to central labs, there are choices for that as well. If you test your own, in our state, these are the options. So there's in-house testing, and then the DART lab, which is here at UC Davis, which is the central lab for testing. So you can define which of those you want to be the default, and then later you can change that if you need to do a one-time submission to a different lab. That would be perfectly fine. But what that does is then define the tests available by those labs, and the lab can define that on their side. All right, and then the next thing would be to put in collections. So typically you'd want to go into new collection anytime you're going to add a collection. There's the trap types that I've chosen here. So CO2 CDC, for example, I just turned on as my choice here. We've got a variety of lures as well. So especially with the 80s problems in our state, we've seen a growth in the use of a variety of lures way beyond CO2 and gravid trap water. So you can put as many of those as make sense. You can see that the default's unspecified, meaning you just didn't say you used that trap, but you didn't say what attractants you used. If you want to use attractants or record those, you can go through and click whatever makes sense. So here's CO2. Let's say I'm using it from a gas canister, you could put that. If I added light as well, I could indicate that. So you can choose as many of those as you like, and they can combine for however many you need. So just put whatever's appropriate for this collection. Collection date, you can type it in using your chosen format in the gateway, or you can just click it on a calendar. Number of traps, number of nights per trap, you can see what it's assuming. So because I'm putting one night collected on the 15th, it's assuming this meant that you started it on the 14th. So this is always the pickup date for the trap. You indicate what site. So again, like any part of that name or site code is searchable. So if I want all the Davis traps to show up in my list, I just start typing Davis, and anything with Davis anywhere in that name would show up. The other thing I can do is type my local code. And if for example, Z05 is my local code, I could type that and it will restrict that to that site. I can continue. You can see when I chose that site, it populated my latitude and longitude. If I want to verify that on a map, it will show you that. And then you can keep going with the collection. It's assuming most cases would be exact coordinate precision. If it's approximate or only to the nearest city, you could indicate that. And then the main thing is to put in only the species you found. So here, let's say I didn't find Egypti in Davis, thankfully, but I'll pretend I did. And then say 1 male, 12 females. Many agencies don't distinguish between the gonotrophic states. So the normal thing is probably to put females mixed, which means you didn't distinguish unfeds, bloodfeds, and gravids within the collection. As appropriate, you can enter eggs, larvae, and pupae for trap types where that matters, like ovitraps. And then you don't need to enter zeros for the species you didn't find. So the system's going to assume that when you enter a collection and you enter whatever species you did find, including if you didn't find any, you just wouldn't enter anything for the species list, it's going to assume a valid collection happened. If ants got in your sample or there was some other interference that made you not trust the numbers fully, but you still want to record the collection, you can uncheck this box. So if that box is checked, that says, yep, ran with no problems, this is a normal collection. If it's not, you can just uncheck the box, and when you save the collection, the system will flag that as one that had a problem, but you still put it in, you still wanted to record the numbers. You can also add mosquito pools to that. So at the bottom, you can see I can start entering mosquito pools associated with that. So here I could, let's say, enter pool number 2, 80s Egypti. Should match the rows above, of course. So Kurt's doing some quality control work to make sure these numbers reconcile, because you shouldn't have fewer mosquitoes in the collection typically than you have in the pools that come from the collection. So here I'm putting my 12 female Aedes aegypti into a pool for testing. When I click save, then it's going to save both the pool associated with all that collection information as well as the abundance count associated with the same collection. So in many cases, you might even test fewer than what you collected. So that's where you can't really trust pools as any kind of measure of abundance. So we got 12 females counted. For some reason, I only put 11 in the pool for testing, which is perfectly fine. And then you click Save Collection. And so both of those records would be saved. All right, let's go back to our list. I'm going to leave without saving that. So that's how you put in a new collection. Once you've got all your collections in the system, you can click on Manage Collections. This you can see is their latest trap counts in this agency. So this is this week, 2020-413, showing the sites where they collected all of those. If you want to go in and edit any of the collections or just see what they were, you can click on Edit. And then that shows you all of that information. So this is one the agency has actually put in this week. Shows you who identified it and all that information I just showed you. All right, so that's the bulk of the data entry for insect collections. That can be beyond mosquitoes if you collect ticks or if you collect other arthropods like culicoides or some of the eye gnats and things like that. If there are other insects you collect, those can go in through the arthropod collections. The pools can be entered two ways. I just showed you the way where the pools are associated with the collection. Under pools, you can also enter them directly. So if you don't want to directly link the collection and the abundance information to the testing information, you can just go in and enter pools. So just like the surveillance sites, I can see over here, what are my available pool numbers? So they're normally, in most states, assumed to start with 1 at the start of the year. You can enter what site code they're associated with. So here's your whole list of site codes. So I'll just pick one for this purpose. Trap types, again, that same list as before. Lures may or may not be specified for this. I'll just say CO2. And then collection date pops up with the calendar. Species, I can just start typing something. So that, just like the other features, if you type any piece of the name, it will start filling it out. So it doesn't need to be the first letters. Here I'm going to put my Aegypti pool. Females mixed. And if you use tab a lot, you can just tab across these fields quite quickly. And then when you tab to the next row, you can see it already knows that the next pool number is likely to be number 2, which you could change if you wanted to. Let's say site 154, CDC, and just keep going like that. So I could enter as many pools as makes sense for a given entry, and that's very spreadsheet style. When you click save, all of those pools will be saved with that basic collection info. A lot of agencies find this way of entering pools to be very useful because they don't always enter pools by collection for individual trap runs. They instead would have a sheet of pools that they just go enter all at once. So this is more useful for that. Also, similar to the collections for pools, there's the manage collection or manage pools option. So when you click manage pools, you just get that list of all of the pools created. So I'll flip back to 2019. And this will show you their pools for 2019, which is going to be a long list, I guess. You can filter it by month as well, which I didn't do. But this is a lot of different pools. You can see for this particular agency, I think it's going to be probably on the order of thousands of pools from, yeah. So there's pool 19343. I don't think they tested 190,000 pools, so they're using a certain number range for the pools for ticks, clearly. So this is an example of tick testing in Ixodes specificus that this agency did as well. And from there, just like before, you can go edit those pools if there's a need to make a correction. If you submit to Central Labs, another key feature of the pools module is the submission piece. So let's see if this agency has submissions. Yeah, okay, so submissions are created as batches of pools for testing. So you can see here that I'll sort them by date. So the last submission they created was 58 pools. It has this submission ID. What it gives you is the ability to print labels on an Avery template. So you can choose your label type. This is just Avery templates again. Label print direction on the sheet of labels, and then which pools do you want to include in those labels. So that can create your labels for lab testing purposes. You can also print the packing list. So once you create that submission, it creates a paginated version of that that has the contact, the basic agency info, and a form identifier for that batch of pools, so that you'd include those sheets in the box with the dry ice that you ship off to the central lab. Then when the lab receives it, all they have to do is know that form ID. They check that against all these pools in the box and then mark it received. And then that generates an email back to the local agency that sent them saying those pools are received for testing in the central lab. And then when the results are in the system from the central lab, they'll get another email letting them know that the results have been finalized and they can go check them in the gateway whenever they're ready. So that instead of it's a great sample tracking feature that allows for easy marking of the samples as received based on that one form ID without having to enumerate all of the pools received by the central lab. Local agencies who test their own samples can also go in and put in test results. So very similar to the pool module, they can go in, and if they've got a spreadsheet of pools or a worksheet of pools from the lab, they can go in and put those pool numbers. They can put the date on which they tested it. I'll just quickly show you what that looks like. If they tested by RT-PCR, which is probably the most common, for West Nile, they want to record a CT score, they could put that in there and then mark it as positive, negative, pending, inconclusive, or other. So if you're going to put in a positive pool, you typically do that, put the CT score, and that's it. Once you've entered all of those, your test results are final, and those would go into the central system. If somebody at your state health department is then doing the aggregate reporting, once these results are in the system and compliant with whatever your state's rules are on acknowledging test results, everyone would be able to see those for state reporting purposes. All right, so for the sake of time, I think I'll skip the Sentinel Chicken module largely, although I know a few of you might be interested in that. So if you are, we can have another conversation about that. Basic idea there is you record flocks and the band numbers of the chickens at the start of the season. After that, you can do collections, which are just meaning blood draws or filter paper strips from those chickens that then get tested for antibodies. So it's very easy once you've set up the flocks and bands to generate collections based on whichever date you're going to sample them. And then you can add the test results either locally or at a central lab. So anyone interested, we can talk about that later. I just know it's not applicable to most of you. Dead birds, very similarly. Our system's rather California specific, but it has to do with managing reports from the public of dead birds. So if local agencies get a report of a dead bird, they can go in and enter that report. Very quickly, I'll just show you because I know a few of you are interested in that. This is what that looks like. It's got basic information on the caller, how many carcasses they're reporting, and then information like what species of bird and so on that they're recording. That's just the report piece. And then there's also a testing piece where if those birds are then tested for virus, very similarly, you can go in and enter new test results for those viruses or for those birds. It's very similar to the pool testing. So if there's a need for a conversation about that, let us know. Applications is a longer conversation, but this has to do with your pesticide applications. So just so you know, you can see the new and managed, just like everything in the gateway, that's pretty typical all the way across. Is everything has a new option for entering a new one and a manage option for managing the existing ones. Before you create pesticide applications, you need to go in and define the equipment. That can be very generic, like backpack applicator, things like that are not having to do with the particular technical aspects of individual equipment. Let me just click that and I'll show you what that looks like. So this is the big generic categories: aircraft, truck mounted fogger, backpack, and so on. So you could leave it at that if that's all you need to record. You can also register your technicians who apply pesticides, so you can put those in the system. In our state, we also record the certification number, which is meaning people certified who have the appropriate continuing education and so on to be allowed to apply pesticides. And then mixes, which is a key element. So mixes have to do with how much of a registered pesticide is in a particular mix along with whatever diluent you add, so that we can back calculate how much of that registered pesticide was applied in a given area. That's important for regulatory purposes in our state. In your states, that can be however you like, but the basic idea is define mixes that make sense to you. This one has not been populated for this agency, but I'll just show you the type of thing we're talking about. So these are EPA registered products at the top. So in this case, somebody's mixing 5 ounces of an EPA registered product. Again, this is our made up one, so don't take this to mean anything. But if you dilute that with 50 gallons of water, and then you go apply a gallon of that mix, we know how many ounces of the EPA registered product you apply. So that's essentially how it works. Once you define those, we can back calculate how much of an EPA registered product for any volume of this mix was used in a given area. That can be important later when you ask questions with your surveillance data of how effective a product is, and potentially for regulatory purposes as well, if that applies in your states. All right, so I'll move on to resistance. I'm not going to go through all the applications and sources, and there's a lot of aspects of how you apply pesticides. For resistance, the number one module here that gets used by local agencies is the bottle bioassays. So if I'm going to create a new bottle bioassay, Jody Simpson, who's one of our programmers and I believe on the call, he defined this module to very much match what the CDC bottle bioassay template says to do for worksheets. So you give any given assay a name. So I'll just say, you know, field testing, Culex tarsalis. Date would be whatever date you ran the assay. Material, there's a whole variety of technical grade products. You can put in a lot of information about those products. If you add a synergist, you can indicate that there, like PBO. I guess malathion and PBO doesn't make any sense, but I'll leave it alone for now. So no synergist. There's a lot of details you can record there. And then test defaults are what you typically put as the starting count in the bottle. So how many live mosquitoes are you starting each bottle with? What's your default time span in minutes? So that's typically 15 based on the CDC recommendations, and then 12 timing events, meaning it will go for 3 hours in total. And so if I add a test species, it's going to take these defaults, pre-populate my first bottles, if you will. So here we've got, let's say tarsalis, I said at the top. So I'll put in Culex tarsalis. If I say that's from the field, I can indicate where it came from in the field. So I could go put a dot on the map. So use the little balloon there and put where that came from. If it came from a colony, on the other hand, I would just indicate the colony name, which should be consistent with a recognizable name to other people who would then know what that means. Here we have a KNWR colony, so I could put that. So I know it's tarsalis, it's the KNWR colony. And then it will start with 25 mosquitoes based on my default. And then sometimes by the time you get the assay set up, you've got less than 25 mosquitoes, no matter how hard you try. So let's say that's 23, you could put that and then keep going like that. And then I'll show them dropping off here like they should do, ideally. And so if then there's 0 alive, you can see it's pre-calculating the number dead. And so at this point, you can enter either one of these and it's also calculating the other. And you go ahead and populate that for every bottle. Additional bottles can be added by adding replicates. So I can add 4 bottles, for example, that are all run with this KNWR colony, and then I could go through and enter those data for each of the 4 bottles. Again, only entering alive or dead, and it calculates the other for you. And then if you have another batch, for example, like you might commonly do, where you run colony mosquitoes, and then you probably have a field collection at least, if not more than one. And here I'm going to do the same thing, tarsalis. I'll say from the field. And in this case, I went and got tarsalis from someplace. So let's say for some reason I ran a trap at the In-N-Out Burger. I'll put that there. And then if you reared mosquitoes in your lab that weren't the first generation from the field, you could put a higher generation number. So F1s, meaning these are one generation removed from the field. Field sample name, I'll put In-N-Out, which just, that can be something that makes sense to you in terms of a recognizable place. And then again, the same process of alive and dead. You can add replicates. If you add additional time series, that'll just add more minute numbers at the bottom. So it'll keep numbering by 15 minutes below. That's about it. So once you enter all of those data, I won't do this obviously to avoid creating fake records, but if I click add bottle bioassay, it's going to take all of that information from a batch of testing recorded in the system that then would be available for later calculations. Under tools, then I think those are most of the data entry modules that initial users will want to use. I'll show you the tools, which is perhaps the more exciting parts of the gateway, where this is where you get to make use of your data. Under calculators, you'll see there are 4 right now. Arthropod abundance anomaly, so that's how your counts from traps are tracking versus historical numbers. Arthropod pool infection rate uses the CDC recommended methods for calculating infection rates in arthropods from pooled samples. Risk assessment is the comprehensive view of risk for pathogens like West Nile. That's fundamentally born of the California West Nile response plan, but any of your states could use that if you so choose. And we're currently working on a method that will allow you to adjust thresholds to your own choices locally for your state. So we should have that out sometime this surveillance season. Vector index calculator then combines abundance and infection rate to get the vector index, which is just a product of those two. So I'll just quickly show you arthropod abundance anomaly. I'm in Sacchiolo agency, so by default, it's going to calculate for my agency. Because 2020 is not very interesting yet, I'll go back to 2019. You can choose your time step, where in this case, I'll do this by disease week, which will take weekly numbers for the mosquitoes in each area I choose. There are also options to spatially filter the data. So the default will be to run it for my whole agency. A lot of times for operational purposes, that's not so interesting. So here I'll just I'll search by Davis. So these are all of the ones for Davis. You can see user Sarah Wheeler had created a spray block, I think. So here you can see that show up on the map when I click include. So there's an area that they were considering for aerial spray. So I'll include that one. And let's also get Woodland, which is our town nearby. All right, and then I'll just do this is the county subdivision based on census. So it's warning me there's a lot of vertices, that's fine. And so here's what that looks like. So for these 2 areas, I'm going to run calculations that will filter only to the surveillance done in those areas. If I want to treat them separately, so I get a calculation for each one independently, I can do that. I can include whatever species makes sense to me. Here I'll put in Culex tarsalis and our Culex pipiens complex, and then treat those independently as well. So that'll create essentially 4 different strata. It will be Woodland and Davis stratified by these 2 species. For the sake of time, I'll do all available trap types. You might want to restrict that to CO2 or gravitrap, whatever you want to run at the given moment. And I'll just do an arithmetic average, just an ordinary average, and click calculate. And so what that does is spatially filter it based on those polygons I specified and any other filters I applied. And then it starts that counter. And as soon as it's done, it will return the numbers to you. So this is showing you the calculation. If you want to click download, I'll do that quickly. That just shows you can download a zip file, and you could download that to your computer if you chose and use it in your own spreadsheet software and do your own analysis. What a lot of people do is just go straight to the graph. So you see from the data, what it's doing is taking the 2019 values by week, which is what I asked for. And it's also getting a 5-year average if 5 years are available for that week. for the most recent 5 years available. So here you can see what goes into the average. If that number gets small, then clearly you know you just didn't have many years to rely on. So it's good to pre-populate some historical data. And then it gives you a % difference from the historical average. I'll put in the graphs, and this is what you get. So you can see I have 4 graphs. So that corresponds to Davis and Woodland independently for Tarsalis and Pipiens. The default is to show you 2019. You can mouse over those and see numbers per trap night, as well as the 5-year mean, which is the blue line. So that's taking these previous 5 years and averaging over those. Sometimes the mean's not super representative of any given year. So you can turn off the mean and turn on other years if you want to compare to 2019 to 2018, 2017, however many of those years you want to compare. So that lets you see how different years tracked in time in relation to the current year. And usually if you're within the season, of course, you're not seeing the whole season like I'm doing here, but lets you do a lot of different comparisons and mouse over the results to see how different years compared in terms of timing. You can click next to see the others. So the first graph there says Davis, that's the QLX Tarsalis graph. If I go to the next one, I'm seeing Davis, the Pipiens complex graph, and the same thing for Woodland Tarsalis and Woodland Pipiens. So different species, of course, tracking differently, and you can do as many of those as you like within the constraints of the calculator. And you could go back to previous years. I chose 2019, but if I wanted to go compare, if I have the data in the system, I can go back and compare 2013 to 2012 or any other number of years that I want. All right, so back to the calculator. So that's how the abundance calculator works. All right, so under calculators, the next one you might be interested in addition to abundance, would be the pool infection rate calculator. That's used most often for mosquitoes, but could be for other arthropods as well. I will go through a very similar pattern of what I selected before, so I won't belabor the choices here, except to say that you can do this by month, by half month, by week, or even your own custom date range. If some other 10-day period makes sense to you, you can do that by specifying the start and end dates for a calculation. For the moment, I'll do that by half month. So I'll do this as October 2014, and then use half months. So there's 24 half months in a year. I'll do it for a fewer, let's say 48. So I want to get 2 years worth of infection prevalence in the mosquito population. I can filter that spatially like I did before. I think just for now I won't, so I'll just leave out the spatial filter, but you could add those same sorts of polygons to limit the spatial area as well. And then species, I'll include Tarsalis and the Pipiens complex. We typically test only females, so this is not a big deal, but I'll pick all the female categories. I want to do that for CO2 and gravitraps, let's say, and treat those separately. And then run the calculation with a 95% confidence interval, and then how you want to scale the infection rates, which in most cases we normally do per 1,000. So I'll just leave that alone. Accepting the defaults is usually the way to go in this calculator, in most of our calculators. All right, and then you get a quick calculation over the 2-year period I asked for, in this case by half month, where you can see the first half of the month is treated as the first day through the 15th day, and the second half is the 16th through the rest of the month, depending on however many days are in the month. You can see a readout here at in the header of the point estimate. So that's your estimate of the infection rate, the lower and upper bounds on the confidence interval, the number of pools that went into the calculation, the number of positives, and the number of mosquitoes tested, so the number of individuals. So just going down, you'll see over season, we're looking at the winter period here, which is less exciting. Here's the summer period where you see a lot more positives, and then of course more individuals tested too. You could download that, do your own analysis anytime you want, or view graphs, which is what most people do. So here's an example of those graphs. Again, this is by half month, but it's showing the point estimate, and as before, you can mouse over to see the point estimate, and then you get a band that indicates the confidence interval. So you specified 95% confidence interval, it's giving 95% confidence intervals here. This is from gravid traps. This is from CO2 traps. And then when you go to the next graph, that's for gravid traps. So you could do a quick comparison of those two if you wanted. You can see CO2 includes heavily the tarsalis populations, whereas gravid get more of the pipiens. So our maximum infection rate estimate here reaches around 8. And then we can go over here and look at gravid traps. And here our maximum infection rate in the gravid traps was 33 when you lump the tarsalis and pipiens together. So you could stratify those by species if that made sense to you as well, and you'd get separate graphs for those too. You can see here late in the season, sometimes when you get positives, the point estimate goes up, but you got that wide confidence interval indicating there were fewer tested and you're less sure about that estimate. All right, so that's the abundance and the infection rate. I won't go into the vector index calculator because that's really just a product of those two. So it gives you a similar capacity to compare vector index in current year versus previous years. I will quickly show you the risk assessment calculator, just because that really integrates over a lot of our surveillance effort. And so for 2019, again, let's do this by half month. I'll do this for perhaps like the North Sacramento polygon, for example, and Davis. So again, you can spatially filter those things. Here I'll treat that independently. In our response plan, there's a definition of what the broad region means. So when you get positives in things like birds and sentinel chickens, if they're near you but not in your specific area of interest, how broad do you want that area to be is what this is asking. In my user type, I said I want the units in kilometers. So it's giving me in kilometers. That's 150 miles in metric or in English units. You specify your virus of interest, where we have this implemented for West Nile and SLE. We can do, in this case, tarsalis and the pipiens complex. I'll throw in CO2 and gravid traps. This particular agency also runs another CO2 beta trap they call the locker trap. I'll do arithmetic averages. Carcass period is just a way of having dead bird related risk persist beyond the last dead bird in case agencies turn that off. If they stop testing when they know an area is very positive, they might want the risk to not drop to 0 when they stop testing. So that's a way to accommodate that. Click calculate, and you'll see the counter starts at the bottom. That's true of all of our calculators, where they allow for up to 10 minutes, although it doesn't usually take close to 10 minutes to run these calculations. But this one runs a lot of calculations in the background on both temperature, sentinel chickens if available, dead birds, mosquitoes, all of those things. So it takes a little longer than some of our other calculators. And what you get here are these panels that show you for whatever strata you chose above, what the results are from the state response plan perspective. So it gives you a 1 through 5 risk rating based on environment, which is temperature, how conducive that is to West Nile transmission. Abundance is the mosquito abundance versus historical average, where 5 means it's much higher than average. Infection is based on the prevalence of infection in the mosquitoes. Dead birds are based on how many dead birds are in your local area. So here you can see comparison of 2 different places, where the top one is North Sacramento and the bottom one is that Davis area. So you can compare those two and see that the overall risk when you average these elements is shown at the top for each half month of the year. And in both cases, it didn't reach what our state considers quite epidemic risk. 4 is the threshold for epidemic risk, and these reached close to 4, but not quite 4 in this year. And 2019 was kind of a low year for West Nile, so that's pretty consistent with all the evidence that went into that. And again, if you didn't hear me before, we're working on a way to let you calibrate those thresholds to your own state so that every state could define risk thresholds that are appropriate to them and allow those to be integrated into your own risk calculation. And the final calculator is under resistance, which is the bottle bioassay calculator. That allows you to make use of the bottle bioassays in meaningful ways. So here I'll show you. You just get a dump of all the bottle bioassays in the system. You can tell whether it's a field or a colony collection. And let's just say I want to compare these first few. So I'm going to add a few from Shasta's district. And so that populates this field down here for selected tests. You can see how many bottles they ran for each assay, what the dose was, and some of the basic details. In this case, these are all for edofenprox, and some of them with a CQ1 colony and some of them with field collections. So it should be interesting to compare. Click calculate. And so that runs our under the hood calculator on this to get you some statistics on those that then you can use for graphs. All right, so what you see down here is statistical estimates for the time to 50% knockdown with a confidence interval, 95% knockdown with a confidence interval, and then you get individual percentage mortality at each time. So here we have CQ1, which is a known susceptible Culex clumphofasciatus colony at 0, 15, 30, 45 minutes, and so on. And what you can see is it reached 100% mortality by 75 minutes. It's often more interesting to look at the graphs, so I'll click graph, and it shows you a graph of these different outputs. If they overlap directly, so maybe they entered something twice here, those you don't see these underlying ones because they're overlapping. Let's see, let me turn those on. Yeah. So you can turn on and turn off the individual elements of the graph. Here you can see like the orange and the gray clearly directly overlap each other. So I'll show you the top three just to avoid that confusion. I'm not sure why that's true in there. But if you had these three where you did CQ1, in this case, for the colony mosquitoes that are known to be susceptible, you can see they go to 100% mortality very quickly. And these are field populations that have clear indication of potential resistance. So those are not even dying by the 3-hour mark. So if you have certain guidelines for when you consider to be the best diagnostic time, you could think about that. Some of our people in our state think the 2-hour mark is pretty indicative of performance under field conditions for adulticides. So if that's what if you agree with that assessment, you could look at the 2-hour mark and get an idea that these are probably quite resistant to edofenprox. And then the CDC guidelines also recommend diagnostic times of something like 30 minutes, where clearly these have very little mortality at the 30-minute mark, whereas these have much higher in the known susceptible colony. All right, so those are most of the tools. The other thing you may already be aware of is we also have maps.vectorsurv.org, and I just wanted to quickly show you a look at that. This is for our state where of course, it's pretty well populated with current and historical data. Your states will also be more populated as you go. If I go over to New Jersey, that's an example of one of our recent states that has added a lot, or even Tennessee maybe has added something too, I see. So here we have New Jersey's data, and the temporal filter allows you to move this in time to go back and see historical data. It only goes, of course, as far back as your data go. So I think in New Jersey, that's something like 2015 or 16. You can interact with the data, like clicking on it for a given place, like Plainfield, New Jersey. That gives you how many positives. It doesn't give away all the data, so it doesn't give you denominators and some of the other things you'd like to have with all the details. But because this is public facing, this just gives you a spatial and temporal representation of general activity trends. It also allows for you to do things like draw a polygon around an area. So here I'm just going to draw a polygon around an area of northern New Jersey. That in my custom area is showing me how many positive mosquitoes there were. It always depends on effort. So the other thing you can do here in the lower left is turn on show surveillance. That gives you a relative idea of how much testing and trapping is going on in those areas, so that you got some context without giving away numbers for how much effort there is. So certainly in these places where there's no testing, you wouldn't expect any positives. We can also share these. So if you click on the share, you can see the URL at the top is changing as I go. So if I zoom in on a particular area and want to share it with somebody I know, it's tracking all of that so that when you share that whole URL, the other person you share with will see exactly your view of the data at that time. Let me delete this polygon here. All right, and then you can also click on share, which gives you a few more options. So you can copy the link to the configured page, which is just basically copying that URL up at the top. You can download the map. You can download the chart on the right if you want to put that in a presentation or a board report for your local agency. You also get this iframe code where if you wanted this to be embedded in your local website, you can copy that code and put that in your local website, zoomed in on your local area, so that you're providing a real-time view of the positives as they occur in your area. Another thing to note, just in case you're alarmed by dots on a map, is all of these are randomly shifted in ways that the user wouldn't be aware of. So they're randomly shifted up to a quarter mile from their actual location, so that you still see the spatial pattern for where the virus is active, but you couldn't go track down someone's household or free the chickens or do anything like that. Also, you'll notice as you zoom in, there's limited spatial detail. Like you couldn't really go to someone's house based on where these points are. That's as far in as I can go. That's as much detail as I can see. And you can see the little fine residential neighborhoods there are not visible. So and the dots moved, so you couldn't do that anyway. So all of those protections keep someone from being able to figure out exactly where a surveillance location is. In our state, we treat Aedes as invasives. They still are spreading in our state. So I'll flip back to California just to show you what that looks like. But this marks where Aedes aegypti, Aedes albopictus, and Aedes nodoscriptus have been found. I know you probably care a little more about albopictus, so I'll go to the areas with albopictus. With the exception of Arizona, who also cares a lot about aegypti like us. But you can click on that and see over time how many albopictus detections have occurred, as well as any collections aimed at Aedes that didn't find albopictus. So you can click on those here. All the pinks here are efforts that didn't result in Aedes albopictus, and this one blue one did. You also get a model-based indication of when the populations would be expected to be reproductively active in the background. Aedes nodoscriptus is another Australian vector that's found in LA, so you can see that one, as well as Aedes aegypti, which I think Arizona and we care a lot about, and in North Carolina, I guess you might, and Tennessee, maybe have occasional concerns about it as well. Dengue and Zika risk, I won't belabor in the interest of time, but you can go explore that. That's largely based on temperature and humidity estimates. If you click on individual places, you get graphs over time. So April is not so exciting, but if we go back into last year, you can see how the map's changing and the graphs are changing to indicate when risk is higher and where risk is higher for these two pathogens. That's based on just the calculation of the reproductive rate that's shown there. The only data that go into that are the general trends in Aedes abundance, which inform this mosquitoes per person estimate. The rest is based primarily on temperature. Once you log in with your gateway credentials, you can also see abundance maps. So for California, I'm showing it here. You can filter it. Let's say we'll go back to 2019, which is more interesting. Culex tarsalis at the level of our state. I'll move into the summer period, and you can see those maps changing. So that gives you a relative indication of where and when tarsalis is high. If you click on an individual place, you also see an indication of numbers per trap night for the whole agency. So I think in your counties or cities that your agencies represent in North Carolina, Arizona, and Tennessee, you could see this if you choose to as well. We just need to get all of your agency boundaries in the system so that we can show them on a map like this. You can see Salt Lake City, Utah is also shown there, and you can click on their agency as well. Again, this is only for the logged in users at the moment. You also get a pie chart showing the relative frequency of finding these different mosquito species. And you can filter it different ways, rural, suburban, urban, by trap type, all of those things. Resistance is a growing map. That's the bottle bioassay data. And in our state, we also have pesticide use data at the 1 mile scale. So we're showing the bottle bioassays on the map as the dots, and then the pesticide use in the background in agriculture has the colors of the counties, and then as you zoom in, you get 6 by 6 mile townships. And then if you keep zooming in, you get 1 by 1 mile sections. And so as the data start growing for these bottle bioassays, what you can do then is click on your bottle bioassay. This shows the different bottle bioassays that are done at that place. So I can click to add those, and that adds them to a chart on the right, lets you interact with them in a very similar way to the bottle bioassay calculator. Hold your mouse over different values, and you can see Sean's got this nice line that shows what the times you're doing, you know, what times you're treating as the diagnostic time as you move across the graph. You can also hold your mouse over particular ones that show you which one is which, in addition to the colors. All right, so those are most of the maps. I think it's probably a great time to stop and take questions. Ryan's asking if you hang a trap and catch nothing is what he means. So in that case, you actually do have a trap nights value. So you should put however long the trap ran, and then don't enter anything for the species. So in that case, you would just not record any species, but the system knows you have a collection, and that by implication, you didn't collect anything. So if you didn't catch anything, just don't enter any species or counts. The other thing I neglected to mention is the import. So another thing to know is for data import, under tools, the top option there is data import. So one of the first things you'll probably want to do if you have existing electronic data especially is import some past data, starting most recently and working your way back. So if you have that, you can go to data import. Those different data types that I mentioned are capable of being imported. To know how to do that, you go over here to the right under import rules and click on that. And then I'll just download it here. And I've done it before, so I'll replace. That gives you our Excel file that shows you the import data specification. So this essentially tells you what the system is expecting. You can see there's samples for the different data types. It tells you specifications. So for surveillance sites, for example, which is the first one, it gives you all these field possibilities that it's expecting for column headings. You'll notice many of them are not required. So if you don't have all of them, don't panic. But then certain things like your agency code, your site code, ideally the name of the site, if it's available, if it's not already in the system, latitude, longitude coordinates are certainly needed. And then the other stuff is optional largely, and it just is not marked as required. It gives you the allowable fields if they're restricted. Otherwise, they're just based on the examples here. It gives you an example of each data entry. And then for every one of those data types, you can go down the page. It has specifications for those. And then there are also corresponding sheets. So if I'm talking about surveillance sites, this gives you a generic, with some creativity of the programmers clearly, example of what the data would look like. And so if you want to enter your own data and you're in Ryan's county, which I think is Forsyth County, and Ryan, I can't remember your agency code, but I'm going to pretend it's FORS. So if it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you could keep going like that and just enter your own data, delete the template data at the top, and you could upload that into our system. Likewise for collections, there's a couple of different ways, like as a spreadsheet with species across the top or species in columns, mosquito pools, and so on. So it gives you examples of all those different sheets that you could start with and fill out for your own purposes. If you're working sort of logically through it, I would start with uploading your surveillance sites, which will define those site codes and then allow you to upload the other data that relate to those site codes. All right, other questions? I see a question in the chat about whether trap sites can be set in the field from phones. Honestly, right now, our gateway is not set up for mobile because a lot of these data types are typically entered at workstations or laptops in the lab or things like that. The sites are one that's on our radar because I think that's the one that could be useful in a mobile device. So I think our programmers have that on the to-do list. It's not near the top at the moment, I'll say, but perhaps later this year or early next, we might entertain that possibility of having a mobile module where you could go out in the field and record a surveillance site. And then just so you know, sometime in May, I think we'll do a webinar for more advanced use cases. So this was the basic webinar just to get started, entering data, managing data, using the tools. We will do another webinar on things like defining the spatial features. So I showed you polygons and just sort of quickly said that people have created those themselves in their local agency. We do have some predefined ones, but in a later webinar, we'll go through that process as well as to how you would upload a shapefile, for example, and into the system to define those features if you already have GIS files in your agency. And then there's also a way you can just go into Google Maps and draw those features and give them names and share them with people in your own agency. So we'll go through that in another webinar, and we'll make sure the link is advertised to you as well. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all for attending, and we look forward to working with you. Send a note to help@vectorsurv.org anytime you have specific questions that can't be answered by some of your state health department contacts. I know all of you in the 3 Arizona, Tennessee, and North Carolina state health departments are on the phone, so we really appreciate your help, and I know you've done a lot with everyone in your state trying to coordinate and get everyone on board, so we're happy to help as well. Just let us know what we need.